So thank you so much for everyone for for joining us this Saturday. This is the first time that the LSA will be organizing a webinar on Beyond the Classroom, Expanding Career Prospect for PhDs in the Humanities and Social Sciences. My name is Said Aderito, and I've been privileged for the past 5 years to be the president of the Legal Studies Association. This webinar seeks to expand career opportunities for PhDs in the social sciences and the humanities beyond the classroom. It will shed light on the symbiotic relationship among institutions of knowledge production, policy, and higher education. Discussants today, Dr. Amina Saliu, Dr. Mark Duxen, Dr. Dipo Oyeleye, Dr. Simon Eve, and our chair, Dr. Tade Ainon, will talk about how they transitioned into their present and past professional roles, the organizational structure of their fields in terms of funding, recruitment, policies, responsibilities, career growth and transformation, and of course, networking, mobility, and professional development with multiple stakeholders, which included academics who are working in classroom, research institute, government officers, policymakers, and donor institutions. Without much ado, I would like to welcome everyone to this very important event that is capable of expanding career opportunities for PhDs and improving the professional development of everyone. I will now let Prince Vincent Anene, who is a PhD student in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, to introduce the chair, Dr. Tadia Inu.
All right. Thank you, Sahid, for this opportunity to introduce the guru, Dr. Taide Aino. Dr. Taide Aino is a senior director of research at the MasterCard Foundation. Dr. Aino holds a PhD from the University of Sussex, master's degree in sociology of development from from London School of Economics, the bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Lagos. Prior to joining the MasterCard Foundation, he served for 6 years as the director of the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research in Kenya, before he was a program director of higher education and libraries in Africa for the Carnegie Corporation of New York, USA from 2008 to 2014. Over the course of his career, Dr. Aina has consulted for numerous multilateral agencies, including UNDP, UNICEF, UNHABITAT, the United Nations University, and the World Bank on issues ranging from urbanization and urban poverty to governance, to social, educational, and public health and environmental issues. Dr. Aino has authored and co-edited 16 books or monographs, 38 chapters in books, 26 articles in journals and learned publication, and several conference papers and addresses. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Tade Aino, the chair of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prince. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'll go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists. But before I do that, there's a part of my life, 2 parts of my life that Prince did not talk about. The fact that I spent more than a decade as a university lecturer at the University of Lagos, which is very, very important to me in terms of the grounding. And then, of course, the stint I had with Codesria in Dakar, Senegal, but we'll talk about that later. So without much ado, we have 4 panelists with us. And I'm going to start the introduction with Dr. Amina Saliu, and then I'll go on to Dr. Dipo Oyeleye, and then Dr. Simon Heap, and Dr. Mark Dwexin. I believe you will pardon me if I drop the title because this is a panelist of doctors. So, so with all due respect, I'll start with Dr. Amina Saliu, who is the only woman amongst us. I should have expected I would have been more gendered, because actually, when you look at that knowledge ecosystems, more female more female doctoral holders are actually beginning to find themselves in non-academic positions to a great extent. But let me start with Dr. Amina Saliu, who works with my very good friend, Kule Shatima. Dr. Amina Saliu is Senior Program Officer at the MacArthur Foundation in Abuja, Nigeria. She's responsible for inclusive grant making and communication, program idea generation, and networking on the Nigerian team. She was formerly a lecturer in political science in Ahmadu Bello University. That was a very, very distinguished and incredibly provocative department of political science over the past 3 decades. She was a lecturer in political science there, and she was senior special assistant to the Minister of Nigeria's Federal Capital Territory and coordinator of FCDO UK AIDS Coalition for Change program. She received her first and master's degree from Ahmadu Bello and a PhD from the University of Liverpool. You're welcome, Dr. Amina Saliu. We look forward to hearing from you. Dr. Dipo Oyeleye is our next panelist that I have the pleasure of introducing. I have a very interesting relationship with the American Council for Learned Societies from my days in the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And so it's a pleasure to welcome you, Dipo, who previously worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for the Humanities and was as the program coordinator for the Humanities Exchange Undergraduate Program, HXU. Dipo has been a Fulbright Fellow and a Mendota Postdoctoral Fellow at UW-Madison, and has won doctoral research awards in English and African expressive cultures. He holds a master's in English from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and master's in Afro-American Studies, and a graduate certificate in public humanities, and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Mark, welcome, Dipo, and we are looking forward to hearing from you in terms of your itinerary as a scholar, moving from the confines of the ivory tower to the I wanted to say big wild world, but I'll say big wide world instead of big wild world. Dr. Mark Dwesson is research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, a historian of Lagos. That is very dear to my heart, considering that I am actually a Pupuaguda boy. Dr. Mark Dwesson, that is the Brazilian quarters of Lagos Island, Pupuaguda. So a historian of Lagos. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 2018 with a thesis titled A Hold on the City, Housing and Landscape History in Lagos, 1885 to 1985. And in addition to many strategic studies and multimedia publications, his journal articles and book reviews have appeared in the Journal of West African History, African Studies Quarterly, and African Arts, among others. And then welcome, Dr. Mark Dwesson. I hope I'm pronouncing the name properly, because I will expect you to call me Omotade Aino or Tade Aino. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Mark Dwesson. So I should reciprocate. And last but not the least is Dr. Simon Heap, who is the long-standing editor of the African Studies Association of the UK ASA UK newsletter. One thing that I learned at the beginning of my career was to respect editors of journals, editors of our professional and disciplinary networks. So I doff my hat, I'll say more respect. Dr. Simon Heap has his degrees from the University of Cambridge and the School of Oriental and African Studies. We used to call that SWAS. He was awarded a doctorate from the University of Ibadan on the liquor trade and the Nigerian economy, 1880 to 1939, funded by a Liverpool Trust Study Abroad studentship. He then held the Antonica Green Junior Research Fellowship at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. I had lots of friends who are associated with that particular distinguished college, including the late Rafiu, and quite a few others were connected with you in that place, including, of course, Gavin Williams, whom we all knew in the field for many years ago. While working in international NGO sector for 15 years, Simon was the first holder of the Britain Nigeria Educational Trust Commonwealth Fellowship in 2011, and back at his alma mater, the University of Ibadan. He currently works as a senior timetabler at Oxford Brookes University since 2016. Dr. Heap's latest academic work include the Postal Service of Calabar, 1890 to 1960, historical cultural artifacts for contemporary tourism, in Calabar on the Cross River, edited by Paul Lovejoy et al. Now, that is also dear to me because you were writing about my in-laws. I did my youth corps in the old southeastern state of Nigeria. And in the true spirit of the youth corps, I did not leave the southeastern state of Nigeria alone. So you're welcome, Dr. Simon Heap.
Doctor, that's very interesting because I met a Calabar lady. I tasted her cooking. I never left Calabar. I've been married to a Calabar lady for 29 years, and I am 4 stone heavier than when I first met her.
Welcome to the club. We will share that offline. There are lots of stories to share about the whole of that area, from Calabar to Ecom to Ogoja. I hope I get a chance to have that conversation with you. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to turn this right over to Dr. Amina Saliu to lead us in a conversation. And they say our hosts asked us a couple of questions, how we transitioned into our previous and present roles. I would say it is actually more about the itineraries of a researcher. And over to you, Dr. Amina Saliu.
Many thanks indeed, my Motadia. I thought you said we're going to drop the title, and I can't have my team lead's very good buddy facilitating this conversation, and he has to be bothered to put a doctor before my name. Let me also say that I got my PhD from the University of Abuja, which is actually another long story to be told some other day, if not today. But I have spent time at the universities of Liverpool, at the Aspen Institute, as well as University of Sussex. Now, some colleagues are borrowing data, and so am I. I'm seated somewhere in transit in a hotel room, and I have a terrible cold. So do forgive me if you hear a frog sort of peep from time to time through my voice, but know that I come with a very full heart. And I couldn't have missed this conversation for anything, for 2 reasons. I like to be part of things that are very innovative, that have an excellent possibility for the future. And second, I'm always on the lookout for new people and new voices to collaborate and to work with. And today's theme promises both. And so how did I therefore get to be where I am today? I think our moderator is very right. The entire thinking about the divide between the academia and spaces outside the ivory tower can sometimes be false. False in the sense that we're the same individuals who crisscross each of those spaces. And for the academia to be the academia, it has to stay connected with community. The entire town and gown scenario that we all know very well. Because after all, what's the business of the ivory tower? is to help think and rethink and to question and to help understand reality. And the most important realities happen outside the ivory tower, even though some of it happens there. Like my brother Tadia, knows very well. He's referenced my political science department at Ahmadu Bello University. And I never saw a space get more political than that department. And in fact, that woke me up. That probably was my wake-up call, because I was a naive 20-something-year-old person when after my first degree, I was invited back to work as a graduate assistant. And then the very first or second academic staff university strike happened. And this time I was not a student. I was a graduate assistant, so to say. I'd finished my master's, and I had an external examiner who said, "Oh, you've done excellent work." I'd looked at women in agriculture, and he said to me, "You know, you need to start your PhD right away. I don't want you to take a break. I don't want you to think about those things that happen to young women like yourself. You get married and you have children and you can't work any longer." And I told my external examiner, but the two are not, they're not mutually exclusive. I can get married, I can have my babies, I can get all the degrees in the world I need, but I would need the support that helps me do that. And I realized that the difference between mentoring and teaching. And the university had then a lot of teachers, a lot of people who knew all the theories, who knew that you had to do your part and have the grades, but who didn't understand always the connection between being a young Northern woman with all the pressures of society and someone who needed to deliver as a young academic. And I therefore got a whole lot closer to the feminist community, which also, because there is no divide really between the academia and the external communities, who were very resident in Ahmadu Bello University. Aisha Imam, Amina Mama, I see Tade Nardin, Shamin Pereira, Jibril Ibrahim. And that was where the mentoring was. And there was that understanding that the human being that I was multidimensional, had many intersections. And all of those intersectionalities could come together because I had those mentors who then said, you know what, it is time for you to leave the academia as a physical ecosystem and move into the wider civil society as a place where you would even do more research, you would connect more with lived realities, and your work would be very relevant, because then I could touch more lives. And that is how in 1999, I became part of the Center for Democracy and Development. So in a nutshell, it was the people connections and the fact that knowledge production is actually everywhere. And until and unless we're able to link all the different kinds of knowledge and find the ways in which knowledge can impact lives, we would really not be more than the sum of our parts, like we say. And for me, I got that chance quite early, but I've always looked back because my very first footprint has been the academia, and I hope to someday retire back in there because I know there's a lot that I can still give back. Let me stop here, moderator, so as a way of an opener and listen to you further.
Thank you very much, Amina. You actually referred to some of my good old comrades. You know, your namesake, Amina, Ayesha, Shamin Pereira, Jibrin Ibrahim, Raufu, and Mustafa, and a lot of people. And I have very fond memories of that department in the days of Yusuf Bangura and the rest of them, and the great debates, the great Nigerian economic transition debates and political transition debates that came out of that department. Thank you very much. You mentioned two important things here that I thought was significant. A lively space. First, the fact that there's a false distinction between town and gown. And I think town and gown is actually a feudal colonial term in that sense, because I think the town, if you look at our universities, some people say that it's not just the town that has invaded some of our universities in Nigeria. The slums also have invaded our universities in some ways. So in a very significant way, I think you're talking about the organic unity between those two spaces. And you're talking about the fact that we cannot be relevant. We cannot completely, each time there's within us as scholars and as researchers, first they need to connect to town. They need to connect to communities. And at times the communities stimulate us in such a way and demand that we move into them to move forward. So that is important. And then the key element, another key point that you made that is very, very fascinating for me and it's important is networking. The fact that you had people, you were networking with people, you were in a vibrant department, and you were in a vibrant community, the community of feminist Nigeria. Amazing work has come out of that community. And it's a community, even though it has some kind of ruptures like any community has amazing, stimulating, vibrant debate. And I actually would like to honor myself by considering myself as a feminist, as somebody called myself an Ibri Masal before. So that's a good point it's a good starter from us because we're beginning from the personal. And we will move from the personal further as we go further. I'd like to come to Dr. Mark Dawson before Deepo. Mark, I would like to ask you to ignite us with some with some material about your journey to where you found yourself.
Okay, I'll do my best. But thank you so much, Dr. Aina. It's a pleasure meeting you, and thanks so much to Sahid for everything he does for the Lagos Studies Association and putting this panel together. And to everyone who's joining us online, happy Saturday to you. I'll say that actually having a weekend and actually having Saturdays and Sundays and working a 9-to-5 job is one of the best parts about switching away from traditional academia and going into government. So, but I'll make an exception for this important event to be here on Saturday. And I think, I'm probably the closest out of everyone on this panel to actually having done this transition. I'm only 3 years out from getting my PhD. It's still fresh. It's still, it's a big bullet to bite. It's something that there's a lot of anxiety and, frankly, stigma around still, is leaving, getting a PhD and not pursuing the traditional tenure track path, not pursuing postdocs. And so it's still fresh with me. So it's bringing up some memories, and I'm sure a lot of the grad students on the call can relate to that, and it's something they're grappling with right now. And so I'll just share a little bit about my story. But I just want to speak to the grad students and just say, what you're feeling right now is normal. It's something I think all of us have felt. And frankly, higher education, I can speak to the United States. I'm not sure so much about Nigeria, but there has become a little bit of a toxicity around the culture of it, that you enter a program and the expectation is that you're going to work around the clock, 7 days a week, mastering your material, becoming an expert in the field for 6, 7, 8, 9 years, with a very uncertain future, and a kind of in a very uncertain career prospects. There's only a handful of positions in your given field every year for a tenure track job, and it's still, I think, viewed as a defeat, or a sign of, there's still some departments where it's a sign of unseriousness if you kind of make it known that you're open to a non-traditional path. And I've had the last few years, as I've started this job at the Africa Center, it's a government think tank in DC. I've had grad students actually from around the country reach out to me and say, I'm very interested in this position, this world that you've left academia for, but I don't know how to make that jump. I don't know how to talk to my advisor about it. I don't know where to start. How do you even start looking for those jobs? And I was in that position 6-7 years ago. I really, I entered grad school in 2013. It was pretty clear to me. I think I had pretty honest assessment of my prospects for the tenure track position. You can look in the American Historical Association publishes the number of positions available each year, and it's a handful. And so it's just a matter of the statistics. And I was interested in an academic life. I'm interested in that's the dream, to just be able to think and write and to be paid to do it. But I also was pragmatic from pretty early on. And one of the things I did that I think helped me a lot was, in addition to doing the reading and writing that grad school demands, was also trying to acquire some other additional skills that are maybe a little bit more pragmatic and applicable to other career paths. So this dovetailed with what I was studying of urbanization and a history of ecology and urban planning in Lagos. But I did a lot of coursework on geographic information systems, on mapping. I learned graphic design, which my whole interest was in making African history and African affairs more imaginable, more visual for an audience where these subjects are very unfamiliar much of the time. But taking on those skills, one, it was kind of a nice break from like the rigor of and the stress of writing and reading in grad school, to be able to do something that was just a little bit more you could turn off part of your brain and just do graphic design. But as I got farther into grad school, again, relationships. I was in a African and African American Studies department, and so there was political science is in the department also. And it's much more common for them to leave academia to do think tank, to do government work. And so there was an individual a few years above me who had already done government consulting, who had already worked and was very much open to going that path. And so he mentored me and showed me that was a possibility, that these are the kind of things you need to do. These are the fellowships to apply for. These are the places in government that hire PhDs. And so I applied and received a government fellowship. It ended up taking me to Benin for a year because they thought Nigeria was too dangerous, which so I hung out in Benin for 6 months, but then went back to Nigeria afterwards. But that ended up opening doors, allowing me to then have a kind of an in these government networks. There was events and conferences as part of that fellowship. And then I realized there is this whole other world beyond academia. There are actually a lot of PhDs working for the government. There are a lot of think tanks doing really interesting policy work. And that started to appeal to me more and more. I love the, thinking about these kind of obscure topics in houses in 1890s in Lagos. But I also have another side of me that is interested in doing work that has, is read by more people, has impact, kind of applying history, applying lessons of history to urban planning today, to policy making today. And I saw an opportunity for that in working for government. So long story short, I applied everywhere. I sent out a ton of applications. I ended up at the Africa Center, which I had never heard of before. But there are these institutions that, they're not as well known as traditional university positions, but they're out there. And it just takes this networking, these conversations. So I welcome students to reach out to me to talk about some of these opportunities. But for me, it's so far it's been a really rewarding experience. You know, I do a lot of mapping, a lot of infographics. I do research too, and then I'm still have the ability to pursue my own research interest. You know, it's being more of a 9 to 5 without a teaching load. I still have time for those other projects. So far so good for me. But happy to continue the conversation and share more. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mac. I think we are beginning to move in an interesting way in terms of the recognition of the connections and the bridge between the different parts of the knowledge ecosystem and the knowledge system. And of course, the awareness of the opportunities that are out there. It's in my current situation, we've been doing my current work. We've been doing something we've been calling the mapping of the knowledge ecosystem. And a very interesting element of that work is related to some of the work that's been done by the OECD. There are a couple of conversations around that, particularly in the area of environmental science and policy in terms of opening up knowledge systems. And I think one of the first things that is coming out, and the point that Mac has made, is that, which is also very similar to what Amina was pointing out, apart from the integrated part of the divide that people have made, we need to recognize that there's something that constitutes a knowledge ecosystem that has higher education, that has research institutions like think tanks and the rest of them, that also has areas in the policy sector that has what you might call public knowledge, that has indigenous knowledge, and that has innovation. A lot of what is going on now in the digital system. And that links in a very fascinating way with the point that Mark was making. Mark talked about extra skills. And I thought we were going to get here that first, and first he mentioned the rigor that the PhD gives you. And I'm not going to steal anybody's thunder. So I'm not going to elaborate on that rigor, because I think our panelists might point that out and how that fits with preparing you for a life beyond the academy. But secondly, he talked about extra skills, and he talked about the geographical information systems and graphic design, the skills that make our new world, the importance of not just digital literacy, but digital competencies, which provides a space for the transition, so that it does not really matter whether our PhD is in ancient manuscripts. Ancient manuscripts will still can be read digitally. There's digital humanities, there's digital social sciences. So even when we are in the humanities, in what people might consider as esoteric area, those areas have applicability not only in terms of the rigor, but in terms of the new kinds of transitions that are occurring in our world, in the knowledge ecosystem. Greater integration, greater digitization of not only skills, but digitization of the media in which we work. And so Mark made that point very clear, that it is not just the fact that we know how to use a good archive, or we know how to do wonderful wonderful interviews, or any other form of research in the social sciences and humanities. Is also intentionally ensuring that we pick up some of those skills that determine our competitiveness. And I'll come back to this conversation around both the demand and supply for our doctoral and postdoctoral colleagues. But I'll thank you very much, Mark. I'll jump to Dikbo to say, Dikbo, tell us your story. Thank you.
Well, it's it's a more, the route for me was, I had always wanted to teach, to be in the academia. So the whole process of getting a PhD and a bunch of masters, I was to prepare me to get a doctoral position, a lecturership at a university, whether in the US or elsewhere. But that changed when I took a course on theories and methods of public humanities that was taught by a director at the Center for the Humanities, Professor Suragaya at UW Madison. Then she's now dean at Berkeley. So it was at that course was the first time I had to pause and ask, how does what we do, how does it change the price of tomatoes in the market? Like we publish this interesting work, do this great analysis, and we share it only with most of the time with very smart people who are in the same field. So it got me thinking that how do we apply humanistic knowledge and method to actually dealing with real life problems? And one of the projects that I did was to think about folk tales. For example, you know, kids growing up, gathering under the tree, or you know, in the living room, and you have, you know, your grandma tell you these didactic stories about animal world, and you are drawing lessons from that. And I thought about how can I bring that to the boys and girls club where I live. And one of the things, and speaking of technology, that came to mind was um, doing an animation of African folktales and presenting it to kids at Boys and Girls Club to keep them busy. And from there, after taking the course and still continuing with my work at UW Madison, an opportunity, a position opened at the Center for the Humanities, and I applied. And the good thing was the course was gave me the language to to tell a story that fits the position. And you know, if you're in the humanities, whether history or you know languages or anything, you're a storyteller. So, and that's one of those things that I advise people to leverage on. And apologies for the noise. I'm at the airport, and this is going to happen a lot. Sorry for the interruption. So, I would suggest that whatever you're doing, from what Dr. Saliu said and what Dr. Jackson has said, there's something about your story that informs the trajectory of your profession. So working at the center for me was the most important thing that convinced me that I could actually function outside the academia and still make real impact. And as the coordinator for undergraduate exchange, uh, students who are in service learning courses and students who are just interested in doing something in the community, they come to my office like, you know, I have this idea, but I don't know how to transform it to a project. So I started learning about design thinking. I started learning idea mapping. So because they helped me to learn all those things, and I could help them transition from I have an idea to now I have a structure, I have a plan, and I'm implementing the plan at the public school. I'm implementing the plan, you know, at old people's home. I'm doing it with the city council. I'm working with the veteran museum on my idea. And some of them went on to do really great things that was recognized by, you know, the state governor and all of that. So the dopamine I was getting from, you know, these accomplishments by people I worked with was so much that I was like, okay, this is a good thing for me to find opportunities to do. But still, after graduation, I was still looking for, you know, academic job, as the case may be. And I got a postdoc. I was in my postdoc when I was invited to apply to the position at ACLS. And part of my work, after I finished with the center, I work with the CHCI, that is Consortium for Humanities Institutes and Centers, which is like a more global platform for humanities centers and all of that. And I help to work on Ideas Podcast for Africa. So where, we try to tell some interesting stories in podcast format and all of those things. So I think that gave me visibility online to a point that, I didn't go out looking for the position. I was invited to apply for the position, which I did, and I started working there. And also, it was a complete transition from what I had been doing at the center, because the center, practical stuff, you're helping people to push things there. But now you are the back end person, helping scholars to get grants that will help them to do their scholarship. So now it's like I'm still in the academia. I'm still helping people in academia, but now I'm the guy that crunches the numbers. I have to deal with Excel spreadsheets. And again, another learning opportunity, because it's not, you're in literature, you don't use Excel spreadsheets. So I have to start, this other training on the job, finding ways to learn how to do the pivot table, how to enter, understand the database that we use, very vast. So it's I think back to what Mark was saying, it's constantly figuring out what to learn to move ahead. And also when you find your place when you find yourself in a position where your passion connects with what you are doing, and seeing that the humanities scholarship has been so underfunded, I count it as a privilege to be in an organization where all we think about is how can we fund this many projects, and that's how I'm gonna end this segment of my story.
Thank you very much, Dipo. Again, intentionality comes out. Although Dipo said he got into his current position by accident. So there's also accident, but then if you're not prepared, you won't be able to take an opportunity. And in the preparation, Dipo talked a little bit about learning and skills beyond just a focus on his disciplinary area. I think that is coming out very clearly. The skills that we need as PhDs to be competitive in the emerging, changing world in which we find ourselves. I thought it was very interesting, and I never said that before. One of my old supervisors had a lot of politically incorrect positions about the doctoral program. He believes, for instance, that it takes a healthy dose of commitment, stamina, and some masochism to want to do a PhD. When everybody else is moving from, masters to do other things and to make money, and you are starving yourself, no matter how wonderful your grants are. And many aspects of your lives are actually affected in the process of getting your PhD and your postdoc. You might be lucky to marry during that period, but even that part of your life is affected. Your social life is affected. It actually makes a lot of demand. So to just find ourselves in this space, to have had the PhD in itself means something. And then he used to say, is the mark of the gods. That was that same supervisor of mine, very old school. Mark, your Harvard, he was actually trained by Talcott Parsons from the Department of Sociology in Harvard, the great social systems theories. So he actually behaved in that kind of way and said those things about people. And I think the fact still remains Not everybody does a PhD. And even if you're an accidental doctoral student, you must have a lot of commitment and stamina to finish. And one interesting thing that also emerged from what we've heard from our contributors so far, I love the notion of your dopamine, the things that stimulate you, that motivate you, that inspire you. We had the same story from Amina. We had the same point from Mark, and we had the same point from Dipo, that there must be something else that ignites you, something else that makes you not only want to finish your PhD, but do something. Make sure you actually cross the bridge between knowledge generation and co-generation and real life situation, actions, policies, whatever it is, administrative programs, whatever it is that happens in that other part of life. Activism is also a very, very important aspect of that. So I will now turn over to Simon Heap, Dr. Heap, to actually tell us his story. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you. Let me start by saying about commitment and stamina. Doing a PhD as an OIBO in Nigeria needs both of those, as well as lots of patience. But let me go back in the chronology. I've always had an interest in Africa since I was a child, though I have no family connections to the continent. And at Cambridge, I tried to do as many global topics on my history with John Iliff and John Lonsdale and other people, and had a very good, and at that time, South Africa was the big issue in apartheid. The fact that John Iliff put me separately for him and I to investigate West Africa, somewhat I was teaching him and he was teaching me, was a very interesting and instructive time of my life. At SOAS, again, doing a West Africa master's, only 2 places in the UK can you do such a thing. And I did a thesis, a little master's thesis on the motor transport, the history of motor transport in Ghana, in the Gold Coast. And it got published. And I say that every page of that little 12-page article was worth about £10,000 each, because that helped me get a studentship from the Leave for Human Trust to go to Nigeria. Now, the reason I want to go to Nigeria is I'm studying Nigerian history, and though I had offers to go to Canada and US and stay in the UK, the idea of going for 6 months fieldwork to Nigeria did not appeal to me at all. And so I became a full-time student at UI. For most of the time, the only white student on campus. I was on campus the whole time. If you know your UI, then you know Tafawa Balewa Hall. And little did I realize that the archives were there on campus, the main archives. So that was incredibly helpful. I did a little bit of teaching, helping out with some of the short staffing that they had, and I enjoyed it. And but the main thing was to be in Nigeria all the time. And even with the strikes, you are a PhD student, you're self-sufficient, you are doing your own thing, but you're also making your own networks. And even though it takes 5.5 years, so what? And when I came back to Oxford, I could say I had done all this field work, but I needed a good library to write it all up. So they gave me a year at St. Anthony's, and that's an interesting place. Terry Ranger and others, lots of other parts of Africa I get to understand a bit more and talk about and discuss. And you see the academic life, which involves lots of drinking and talking and more drinking. And then I got a bit of a point where I wondered what I was going to do. And I frankly had a year off, another gap year, just a kind of year to think about what I want to do. And I ended up applying to go to Nigeria. And then afterwards, at St. Anthony's, I had no hesitation. The next day that I finished the fellowship, I was straight into an NGO job. So I joined an NGO called INTRAC. INTRAC, International NGO Training Research Center, is an NGO that helps other NGOs in the north, in the south, with kind of organizational development, but research as well. And I started off as very lowly research assistant and immediately became a researcher. And we had the full foundation. Again, a theme I might come back to is about money. Personal money, your salary. I think I could have earned far more money, but some ways by being in the NGO sector and in development, money has come to me very readily. I've hardly had to write a grant proposal in 25 years because the NGOs and the foundations have had that connection, and I have operationalized the money that has been got for me. And NGOs want to know what works. How did it work? What works? And can we do more of it? So a theme of my development life is about action research and about scaling up, and in all sorts of ways. In HIV and AIDS, in water and sanitation, you're looking at one of the world's experts on how to build a toilet around the world and how much it costs. You get into all sorts of different areas and interesting areas. At Interact, I did work on NGO and business relations. That gets me into interesting areas of not just the NGO world, but the corporate sector. We get to a senior person at a business who wants to know about all these pesky NGOs, these environments, and you're given 3 minutes to explain your project. You may even be given 1 minute with the big boss, and you have to be thinking on your feet. You have to be diplomatic, but you have to be quite precise in what you're going to say and how you're going to sell yourself. I then was given money from UKA, DFID, to look at civil society in Central Asia. I have no background, I have no knowledge. I now have huge amount of knowledge about Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. I had 3 years of going back and forth to Central Asia, and it got so bad, the travel, that I had to have 2 British passports to cope with all the visas that these ex-Soviet nations required. And it's only recently that I have reduced back down to having 1 British passport, but that's how much travel there was taking place. I come back to a more wider thing, which is simply your PhD gives you the skills to do certain things. I mean, you're very good at interviewing, focus groups, questionnaires. Just yesterday, I had a focus group at the end of the bus stop with my students. Why are the students waiting for a bus to go to another campus? And it's because they don't live on that part of the campus. And as senior timetable, I need to think creatively as how I can get them avoiding bus stops and having to do bus travel. PhDs, you are obviously very logical. You can see patterns and connections. This is also seen in my NGO work. And a slightly older person, myself, a kind of career change 6 or 7 years ago into timetabling, and which is, if you can know about your Sudoku and your Tetris and your crosswords and your 3D chess, I do it all together at the same time to get 50,000 teaching events onto Google Calendar for all the staff and students. I have a team of 9. I'm in the office at the moment, and I do have another doctoral colleague, also historian, and it just shows you that you can. He's also he also went into university administration straight away. But I would say that having your doctorate gives you the confidence to try things, try new things. And my personal view was to do something that had impact in the field, in communities, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, but also back here in Oxford. I am the long-serving treasurer of my local community association, and I'm quite active in doing other things as well. So the transition to an academic job somewhat wasn't even on my thoughts. And I think back in the 90s, and still now, as Mark has said, it's quite difficult to get in there. And I think you should. And the reason why we're in this webinar is there are so many other jobs, so many fields, and NGOs, UN bodies. One of my bit of my biography that I didn't even mention. I worked for the Japanese government in their London office for a couple of years as a bilateral. I always thought I'd love to work for a bilateral development organization. I ended up working for the Japanese in an office for 5, trying to translate British European thinking of development into Japanese East Asian way of looking at development, connecting North America with Africa as well. So there are lots of possibilities, and you should feel confident. I mean, if I was really confident, I almost would have started my own NGO at the beginning, but I thought there were so many other ways of getting involved in having an impact and helping change people's minds, which is behaviors, which is quite an interesting and tricky thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think this is great. You've actually done the bridging from the demand side to the supply side for us in this conversation, and I really, really love it. I love the fact that, you know, like I said, it takes a crazy to want to do a PhD, but also those skills which you talked about. Your PhD teaches you certain things: logic, patterns, connecting, systems thinking to some extent, interview, rigor, focus, you know, making sure you cover intellectual and academic integrity, making sure you cover the field, you know, what's out there. All of those are from the, what I'll call the supply side. The things about you, us, the doctoral graduate students, the doctoral people, those of us who are PhDs and postdocs. All of that comes from what it is that we bring to the field, we bring to the world. Rigor, I have always said, one of the things that you get is rigor and discipline, intellectual discipline. Discipline within your disciplines, because that's why they are called disciplines. They have a particular way of thinking, a way of speaking, a way of analysis, and a way of engagement with the realities that we face. And that's similar to what our previous colleagues have talked about generally. So it's very important to say, coming with a PhD, there are attitudinal elements, there are elements of our training and rigor, there are elements of our disposition that prepare us to be competitive if we only use it well. And there are ways to use it well, by, for instance, through mentoring, through understanding how people have made transitions. And it's funny because I'm going to make a point that is very interesting at the level of the supply side. In the transitions, there are settings we go in. And I remember Professor Amina Mama at a retreat we had many, many years ago when she was acting as a facilitator for the Ford Foundation. I was actually the regional director for Ford Foundation in Eastern Africa then. This was in somewhere in Stellenbosch. The first thing Professor Mama did was to ask all of us to write all our titles on a piece of paper. And she was with another facilitator from Uganda, Hope Chigudu. I remember that very clearly. And they had a barrel. And then we all put our titles in there. And then we said we had a nice little bonfire. So we all walked in as Dipo, as Amina, as Simon, as Tadi. One key element, one thing that stands in our way, particularly, and I'm going to move now to the demand side, that stands in our way when we make the transition. And you know, we earned these positions. We earned our titles. Whether as there, again, that my crazy deceased supervisor used to say, there are only 2 titles you earn in the academy: the PhD and the professorship, the tenured professorship. Every other thing is an appointment, dean, provost, We earn those titles, but those titles also stand in our way. So occasionally you discover that in the UN or in some foundations, people don't like you. calling yourself doctor this, doctor that, professor this, professor that. At times it's intimidating. At times it's actually one other thing that's very important in the doctoral program, because I think by the time you finish your orals and your viva and you defend yourself, the first, and Simon, you were talking about the two centers for West African history, SOAS and I believe Birmingham, is it?
Yes, yes.
Yes, because that was where I did my viva. And there was an ASA UK. I was from Sussex and I did my viva. And there was this thing that there was this African, there was an ASA with students, graduate students from the Caribbean and Africa there. And they said we were going to lock these people in until that guy passes his PhD. So you had all this dreadlock and all of them walking up and down. Hey man, what's going on? There's a brother in there. But I don't think that terrorized my external examiner, Robin Cohen, who was from Birmingham at that time. I don't think that was what terrorized him. And one of the points I'm making here was that he made it clear that the PhD is the beginning of learning. There are many of us for whom it's a magnus opus and it's the end, but not too many these days. Not too many these days. You know, it's not the old German tradition that that piece of work constitutes the beginning and end. And therefore, it's the fact that learning is endless. And this is the point I want to make as an attitudinal factor, an attitudinal element in our transition. The fact that we know we stand or we're sitting on the shoulders of layers and layers of giants. And that even there, in spite of that, no matter how high that tower is, there's still the infinite expanse of the skies of knowledge, of the terrains of knowledge, the landscapes, Mark, the landscapes and the skyscapes and all the scapes of knowledge, and beyond the universe, the pluriverses that constitute the arena of knowledge and learning exchange. So the fact that we are there, we then therefore have great humility. And it's we are forced to, we cannot, no matter what you, as a PhD, you are examined and over-examined and critiqued. When you start writing these papers, no matter what, there's something called peer review. Somebody else is going to take a second look at it and say, hey man, your punctuation is not right, even if the whole substance of your argument is right. So that capacity to humble ourselves, and one of my own mentors, Amina, was Professor Claude Ake. And he told me, in fact, he was the one who took me to Codesria. And he told me, he said, Tade, if you don't have humility, cultivate humility. I think one thing that the PhD does is actually seen to us the great expanse of knowledge that we have no option but to surrender and submit to the humility that knowledge is endless. It's endless. If you take it from Mark's work, from these scapes, these scapes cannot be captured. You cannot entrap them in spite of whatever people are trying to do in some parts of the world with COVID. You cannot lock it in. You can't lock in the atmosphere. So that's one key element in terms of our attitude as we begin to move to the supply side. It's a demand element in terms of our value, in terms of our attitude. Even if you won the gold medal in your institution for your doctoral thesis and dissertation, and you won all the awards, you will always see from the story of Simon, of Amina, of Dipo, of Mark, that the awards are endless. It's from one to the other. So there's no dead end to that work unless, until we taken out without our boots. There's no dead end. And that's the key element in this transition. The capacity to have the imagination of an endless terrain and scapes of engagement. And of course, the humility to understand and recognize that. Now, another element, so that's, I would say, is a supply factor, but it's a key element in the way we are assessed in the demand end of this thing. I'm using labor economics thinking, when I'm talking about the demand, and I'm looking at the doctoral labor market, because that's what we've been forced to do at the MasterCard Foundation. The research labor market, the team I'm working in, we are looking at the research labor market. We're doing ecosystem mapping. We're looking at where, and you started that conversation for us, Simon, because you started with the NGOs. Mark talked about think tanks and governments. I had another interesting experience when I was in Carnegie, and recognized that a lot of the PhDs that we gave, even in the sciences, because of the nature of apartheid and because of the scarcity of capacities in South Africa and the opening of opportunities, quite a lot of people transited from the academy into local governments as directors of planning, as directors of operations and things like that. And there was a wistful element of regret. Why invest in these people that they spend all these years instead of going to form the capacity of the Black Academy? They are actually moving into local governments, they're moving into, but they were also, of course, they were better paid, because if you're a lecturer, a rookie lecturer, which we call lecturer 2 in Nigeria, a rookie lecturer, you're not going to get the same as a deputy director in a local government. And so there was a difference in that. You're not going to get the same kind of support, particularly if your work is a knowledge work where you will have other people within the hierarchy. So we've started talking. Amina is from philanthropy, just like I am at the moment. We have Mark. Mark is from government, a policy institute. We also have think tanks. Simon, you talked about NGOs, both national and international NGOs. Deepo, you talked about academic networks and disciplinary networks like the American Council for Learned Societies and the ASA UK, the ASA USA, and several other of those disciplinary networks. Of course, they prefer, those networks would prefer somebody who has some kind of engagement with their substantive disciplines. Most times is a PhD. The question is that we do not know. The problem is knowing that these opportunities exist, that opportunities exist in foundations. Again, foundations tend to be very substantively oriented in some cases. They are looking for somebody who has a connection, who has understanding of gender analysis, who understands gender work, who understands policy that is inclusive policies. They are looking for people with substantive training and research experience in certain areas. But then they move, like I keep telling my colleagues in the foundations I've worked with, that you are no longer a researcher, but you are becoming something, a new kind of occupational status that lots of people have not paid attention. And in the social science, the state of the social sciences from UNESCO, I think the one I contributed to around 2004, I talked about this emerging research manager occupation. Ibn Masal contributed to the latest one. It sounds, I hope I'm not sounding completely out of date because of these dates that I'm dropping. This is a dinosaur that has refused to die, to ossify. But in a very interesting way, there's a new occupational category that is emerging. It is the occupational category of the research manager or the research program manager. And the research manager first, because you are dealing with researchers, you must have demonstrated that you know how to do research and you were part of the research community, both in terms of the attainment of your PhD and the attainment of some publications. Not necessarily the kind of publications you need for your tenured professor, chair, and all of that. So that's one pathway. But what I keep saying to my colleagues in the places I've worked about that pathway is that yes, you need the PhD. Yet, yes, you need the depth of substantive knowledge. But more, you need to be more universalistic. You need to be more open. You need to be able to manage portfolios of research. And so you're going to be a jack of all trade and a mistress of all in some ways, at least superficially. You do not have to know what is in there substantively, but you know where to find the people who know in terms of the grant making and the partnering that you do. You need to know who knows. You need to know the ecosystem of the work in the substantive field in which you are managing research. And that's the kind of thing we're doing currently in our foundation with the work we're doing around research. So that's also another occupational category. Nobody's talking about it. We do not know how to call it, whether it's the research program manager or is it the research manager. But there's a distinction there between the researcher, core researcher, and the research manager who manages a portfolio of research work. So, Samuel, you are leading us into the supply side. And then there's something else which is coming out of our scoping, which a lot of people have not woken up to. And I'll do a little bit of nuancing and tension raising here. And that's what we now call the research business. If you look at the ecosystem, and actually more money from FCDO, the last time I heard about it, went to the research business people rather than to the researchers in Nigeria. Although, there was a lot of investment in research on the continent to university-based researchers. So when you're talking about the research business, you're thinking of the big 5 consultancy companies, the PwC, the KPMG, and co, and the Deloittes. Then you are thinking of the McKinseys, the Boston Consulting Group, the ITADs from the UK. And you're thinking of a whole range in the second tier that I imagine. And then you're thinking of actually a new thing that a couple of young researchers are beginning to do. Because I am in my current work engaging networks of researchers who have formed themselves into consultancy teams in a non-hierarchical manner. It's almost like a firm of architects or, an HMO in which researchers come together. Of course, there are senior partners and maybe there's one necessary for, and we have quite a lot of that emerging on the continent today. Quite a lot coming from the global north. The UK is actually exporting quite a lot of that kind of research business, not in the general, not at the level of the McKinseys and the Dalbergs and the Boston Consulting Groups. That's one level. That's the top of the heap. Then there's the level of the 5 consultancy firms, the KPMGs, the Deloitte, the PwCs. Most times, now this is the caveat, most times the consultancy firms prefer the MBAs, the business school types. But increasingly, when they need substantive knowledge, either in financial inclusion, either in digital inclusion, either in areas of policy, peace and security, and several other areas like that, they come to the substantive knowledge expert, subject matter expert, and they come to the PhDs. And that's where I said the attitudinal element is important. So you do not go there with the chips on your shoulders. I have my PhD from Harvard. I have my PhD from Ibadan. I have my PhD from Ahmadu Bello, from Cape Town, from any of those places. You go there as a colleague, as a co-traveler, as a co-creator of knowledge, knowing that every contribution is valuable. And you bring there, if it is about, if we are looking at things that people have not looked at, indigenous knowledges around climate change in certain areas of seeds, you most probably spent 5 or 6 years, like Mark and Simon and Amina talked about, struggling with this, some kind of looking at traditional seeds and all of that, which could actually be a humanities, social sciences, and at the same time, biological sciences and nutrition, cross-disciplinary kind of work. But if you looking at the last seeds or whatever, you bring that knowledge and you will be a valuable member of that team. And in the imagined world we are entering now, there is a crossover that is bringing together the intersection of indigenous knowledges and digital, the digital world in a very interesting way. Some people call it innovation. I think it's one of the most creative ignition that is occurring. And it is actually the basis for potential leapfrogging in this whole arena of knowledge systems, in which some of the things we've learned from ethnography, from folklore, from history in particular, both oral and other forms of history, from sociology, from political science, from the humanities, also, from the study of ancient manuscripts, the study of Ajami literature and Ajami knowledge, the study of the non-colonial libraries and the colonial libraries. All of those studies actually are not irrelevant. They are not useless in the new kind of world we are entering. In the world of breakthrough, people keep talking about the fourth industrial revolution. But the fourth industrial revolution is not just about technologies alone. It's not about artificial intelligence, machine learning, nanosciences, and all of those things. It's a combination. The humanities are strong players in that area, not only in terms of values, but in terms of the repository of human knowledges and its intersection. So my colleagues, my graduate students, colleagues who are here, my fresh docs and postdocs, the challenge, like I said, so we've talked about the supply side, the think tanks, the NGOs, national and international, the policy institutes, the foundations, the local governments, the research networks, like PASGA, in which I worked for some time, like CODESRIA, like AERC, like ATPS. All of these are headed by PhDs on the continent. And then, of course, the international and national and regional NGOs. And of course, the spaces in bilaterals. You talked about that, Simon. In the NEPADs, AU development and NEPAD. In the regional economic commissions. You know, this is not a case of the magician that dances, in the market square in Lagos. The more you look, the less you see. This one, the more you look, the more you see. You've got to intentionally look. And that's the challenge here when we begin to, and you must do the initial work, not just the skills that Mark, that Dipo, that Amina, that Simon and myself have talked about, the soft skills and the other skills. You must always equip yourself, because you cannot be a static being if you're going to be moving. Even the nature of our disciplines are changing. But the knowledge ecosystem, particularly the research element, the research and innovation subsystems of the knowledge ecosystem are changing. Yes, Dipo, you can ask a question, please. Sorry, I was just trying to make the link between the personal journeys, but also the fact that this is a conversation now about what is the labor market analysis for the doctorate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Over to you, Dipo.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. From what you're saying, I could see some of these organizations some of our participants are hearing about them for the first time, and they don't understand. Like some may not understand the mechanisms of how to move from A to B. how to start thinking about what they are doing at our, for those who are in Nigeria, at our Nigerian universities, because I could remember that the whole idea of NGOs seems to be out of reach of people who are doing graduate studies in Nigeria. It's not that far-fetched if you study abroad, right? Because you like, I worked at the center, I did that gave me a leverage into the world of that kind of the NGOs. I interacted with centers and all those other things, and that was the story I told to get the job that I was asked to apply to. I still have to tell a story that I'm experiencing something like this. What would be and this is also for everyone, like, what would be your most important advice for participants who are just listening to us and for the first time they are rethinking where the prospects are, without also necessarily having to travel abroad?
Like 37:45.
Thank you, Dikpo. Let me throw this to our colleagues. Let's go back to Amina, and then we'll come to Simon, and we'll come to Mark, and then we'll come back to you, and then I'll join. So let's start. Yeah, let's take this question. It's a great question. Over to you, Amina.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, my brother Dikpo. I think as I was listening to our chair, it occurred to me that sometimes the disconnect between the way in which relationships are structured in the academia vis-a-vis other spaces that we've been talking about is really in terms of the dynamics of power. And what do I mean by that? In the academia, when you study for a PhD, I mean, let's face it, it's a lot of backbreaking work. You have earned it. And when you have earned the rights to be called a doctor so and so, you want to show that you have earned that right. However, outside that very restricted space, you find that you need a certain kind of humility, like our chair has said, because there are people who haven't been through the four walls of school, but their lived reality trumps your one research case study that has given you a PhD. And so in this wider civil society context, in philanthropy, for example, there's always that value of consistently learning. It's important to continue to learn, because unless you learn and understand the lived reality of the people that you want to work with, you might just misapply the resource. You might find that your methodology totally does not work, because what is on the books is really not what applies on the ground. And so that need to bring what the literature says and to further test it and to test it again in the court of public opinion, as well as listening to the people who really are experiencing that life, becomes a new kind of approach that is probably even more superior, so to say, to whatever might be in the books that might have been thought to have been the quote and unquote authority on that particular issue. And so you come with a certain kind of power, thinking, well, I have earned this, I know something, and then you find that you don't know enough after all. Because one simple question might call to question the entire learning that you have. But it's a very good tension. Why is it a very good tension? You need to have the confidence to say that, yes, this might be a lived reality of this particular community, but I also come with my own lived reality, and this is what I have learned. I am the one who's gone to the field to do the research, and I know what I have studied. And a lot of the time, the philanthropic world actually welcomes people who push back at them, who challenge the knowledge that is in there, because they have the courage to bring a new kind of knowledge. And a PhD gives you that. The second thing I'd like to say about the strength of a PhD is your ability to write and to rewrite and to rewrite and to rethink. Because sometimes, as you know very well, you might think, oh, I have this chapter downright pat. It's all beautifully written. And you face it, I know, and it hears it from middle to end, and you have to start all over again. And of course, you're going to cry a few tears, but those tears strengthen you, because you're going to meet an even more ferocious core of peer reviewers. You wouldn't believe it in the philanthropic world, but you will, because now you're competing for resources that are scarce, and you have to prove why your thinking is superior to that of your colleagues. And coming from the academia prepares you to be able to make an argument, to be able to write logically, and to be able to tell a story of change. Now, it might not always be fully formed, and that's something that I have learned, because I had to, fortunately or unfortunately, I do not know which, for the first 1 or 2 years of my life outside Ahmadu Bello University, I was told, you write like an academic. I'm like, but that's where I'm coming from, that's all I know. So I guess the difference is you write like a scientist, but the philanthropic world expects you to write like a technologist. So in the academia, you're learning for learning's sake. It's allowed for you to have a research interest and for you to see through and for you to follow through. But once you cross that bridge, you have to prove that the knowledge you have will be relevant in transforming the lives of the people whom you're going to come across. You have to prove that spending money for clean cook stoves is something relevant because it protects the environment, because the science tells us that 70% of deaths for women in the rural areas occurs because they do not have access to clean cook technology. So your science has to connect to technology before you get the resource that you need in the world of philanthropy, for example. And so trying to make that shift between learning for learning's sake and learning to transform lives becomes something you need to do. And in doing so, you have to learn some humility, of course, but I wouldn't say throw away your pride. It's good to have some academic pride. It's good to have some confidence of who you are and the fact that you have earned who you have become, but you're also willing to continue to learn. The other thing that I'm going to say by way of advice, as my brother Diko has said, is that there are certain spaces that you need to find yourself in. And I think our chair has absolutely referenced that. You need to find some communities of practice that you have not always been part of that helps you understand this new field outside the academia. And there's certain kinds of subscriptions, for example, that you have to be part of. For example, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. It's absolutely essential learning and reading and analysis for anyone who wants to understand why will a Gates Foundation want to fund malaria vaccine in Africa? Why will they then jump from there and go into agriculture? Why will a MacArthur Foundation pull money together with the Ford Foundation to think about gender equity and social inclusion at the heart of COVID? You can understand the way these organizations think even before you have gone in there. And the Chronicle of Philanthropy is an excellent way to ease yourself into understanding that world and even doing an analysis of some of the things that that community might have taken for granted. Another quick advice that I might want to suggest is that sometimes people who are fresh PhDs might want to test the waters by coming together to form a consortium of their own. Form a consortium, try to write a proposal. You might not get through the door the first time, but I tell you, the learning you get in answering some of those questions that are iterative. Self-iterative in the sense that when you've answered one particular question and you go to another question, you wonder whether you haven't answered that question before. They're actually structured in that way to ensure that your thinking is quite logical and you're thinking about your risks and how you might mitigate them. And so coming together to form a consortium of equals allows you to test the waters. It allows you to understand the ecosystem a whole lot better. It also gives you an entry point. And if you do get a grant, that means a whole new learning. And then you get to expand your team. How do you expand your team? You won't believe it, but there's a lot that happens on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is one very strategic community that you probably are underusing or maybe not paid much attention to. Not much really. Twitter is the place where things get told, for example, as far as I know. So people go onto Twitter to put their intentions out there or to rave and rant at each other or to put out there the tyranny of 140 characters. But with your LinkedIn, you not only can post your work, you not only can find and be found, you not only can be part of emerging communities that can pay attention to your new learning, and allow you the space to actually have your say and be part of a new team that you never thought possible. And it does not discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're a newbie, quote and unquote, if you have 30 years experience. No, it's not a hierarchy of power. It's a hierarchy of imagination. And a lot of the time there are opportunities there that you can actually apply for. Again, to test whether you're ready or not for the field. And if you do get in, to begin to build your own portfolio and to begin again to expand your network. But, you know, suffice to say that learning has to be a constant. Nobody has the monopoly of knowledge when you're out there on the field, because this knowledge continues to transform. It transforms as we learn every day, and that is as it should be. I mean, while I was a political science student, my political economy teacher told me the notion of a household head, and the notion of a household head was male. And I have since learned that that knowledge is absolutely obsolete, because all I have to do is visit the internally displaced persons camps anywhere in northeastern Nigeria or in north central Nigeria, and I would find that the notion of the household head has transformed. It's more female than male. It doesn't mean that my professor was wrong. It meant that my professor's knowledge was the product of a certain time, which has now evolved. And when you're on the field, you have to stay relevant, you have to stay committed and connected to that evolution of that field where you find yourself. The same thing, the notion of work. Work has always been seen as something that is productive, you know, that you put in effort, yes, but also earns you some return. But where do you place unpaid work? Majority of women fall in that category. Majority of the household, how do I put it? Homemakers who don't earn anything, but they do work. And Oxfam has told us that the cost of that it's $10 trillion every year, but nobody is paying for that. Yet everyone who goes to earn an income is actually able to do that because there's someone behind them who does unpaid work. So if you're coming from a position of knowledge that is a little bit good, but narrow, you have to be very open to learning, to bringing in your own contribution, but also to listening. And I find a lot of listening also gets us ahead a whole lot more and gives you an open mind, even though sometimes the things you hear for the first time might be crazy, given where you're coming from, but being able to give the benefit of the doubt would help you get ahead as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amina. Over to you, Mark, on those points that
Thanks.
Deepa raised and more.
Yeah. This conversation around humbling ourselves and leaving academia is really speaking to me. Journey now, the past several years, and ego in academia, I think. And in order to be successful in applying ourselves and finding other pathways, it is humbling. And I think it takes a willingness to do the spreadsheets, to pick up these new skills, to jump in and do other tasks. And that's been the case for me. And it's how I was able to get a think tank, a government job, was by applying to positions that didn't require a PhD. And I got in, I was part of the team. I was sort of doing, you know, some of the daily reports, the kind of more the grunt work, and proving myself that I was willing to do that I was willing to wear multiple hats. And, you know, over the course of a couple of years, I think my team saw that I had a lot to offer, had, you know, was a valuable asset, but I had to put in that time and really do things that, you know, you don't need a PhD for necessarily. But I think then it was interesting because I've maintained my interest in my doctoral work, and have been revising that project the past few years. And I took a break from it. And after working in my current role, I went back and relooked at it and decided to write a book proposal for an adaptation of it. And like the clarity with which I could see what my project was actually about was remarkable. After like Amina is saying, understanding what is significant about the work in academia, you can get very hyper focused in on the minutia or these esoteric academic debates that are fascinating and important, but when you're trying to write a book proposal for why not just specialists on the subject should care about houses going back to the 1890s in Lagos, but why that matters, why this history is informative for the city today, for a city facing these dual issues of rising seas and overpopulation and a shortage of housing. So that humbling experience, I think, allowed for a lot of growth in my own thinking and realizing that there's knowledge and ideas beyond the academic journal. And then just on one other point, Tade, I think you're absolutely right about these new kinds of occupations, about research managers and kind of different roles for shepherding the production of knowledge and bringing people together and creating these kind of knowledge clusters or whatever we want to call them. I think another role that I would mention, and it's partly what I do now at the Africa Center, is strategic communications too. I think that these knowledge producing organizations that are trying to make an impact, trying to influence policy, they're giving more thought, more intentional thought to how they communicate those findings, how they have it reach policymakers, to reach the right people. And they're hiring people to have a fluency in the academic work, in the research, who can understand it, and then re-articulate it, to boil it down, put it out on whether it's social media, whether it's blog posts, proposals, but just thinking about how we communicate our research. And that's something that I think is it's really been a fun challenge for me, because in academia, there's just not much thought put into that. Professors are happy to publish their lifetime of work in an obscure journal that is going to have, a few hundred downloads. But, I think there's so much more that academics could do with getting their research out there, with promoting it, with having it have these kind of influence on conversations. And that's still, there is, in these knowledge ecosystems you're talking about, there still are walls in them. I think that the policy world is very unfamiliar with a lot of the most recent African studies work being done, the work being done in African history, because it's not promoted well. We all have only so many things we can read in a day, and so we're reading the policy pieces, the pieces that are published in the Washington Post and New York Times, in those places. So academics, I think, need to also kind of take things away from this conversation. People who are participating today, who might end up going on to tenure track positions, I think that they can learn from these conversations too, and about this knowledge ecosystem and how to influence it beyond the ivory tower. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to go to Simon, but I'm beginning to see some questions that I imagine. And one key element is that if you want to make this crossover, what will you do? Where will you show up? Where do you want to find yourself? And then a question that's coming from some of the comments in the, what's the balance between, because, Mark, you raised that. What's the balance between your academic publications and your other kinds of publications that also enhance knowledge? And that is a practice question. It's something that we are beginning, particularly in areas of indigenous knowledges that we are exploring. But let's hear from Simon first, and then Dipo, and then we're getting close to the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me talk about entry into non-academic ways in two ways. One, a kind of soft, indirect way. My experience is that volunteering, being an intern, getting your foot in the door, being in the right place at the right time, even though you don't know it, is incredibly important. You're being humble, you have a PhD, you're expecting a big job, but you go and volunteer and you help out an organization. Let me give an example. Somebody came through our door in the headquarters of Plan and they volunteered. And Plan is a humanitarian child-focused NGO. And it would just start a little bit about emergencies and disasters. And they just employed a very big guy to help develop that part of the NGO, international NGO. And the volunteer got going. And 2 weeks later, the Haiti earthquake happened in 2010. That volunteer became a full-time staff, became a key coordinator of people on the ground, logistics, getting people into the right place. Money was flowing in, but you need to spend it. NGOs get money, they need to spend it. There's nothing worse than returning their money. So he was in the right place at the right time. He didn't know it, but within 3 months, he really did know it, okay? So there's a soft entry side. The other side is the direct, hard applications, okay? And I break that down. There are often a lot of research jobs in the NGO sector, in the international NGO sector, in the local branches of UN and other NGOs that are called monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation, M&E, that's a key skill. You don't do that much directly at university, but researchers are in a great position to be monitoring and evaluating projects. Projects need to be shown to have done something, to have had beneficiaries, to have some impact. And M&E specialists are not plucked from trees. They have to get in there and they have to show that they can analyze and sort out and work out the reasons why something worked, and just occasionally why something completely fell on the ground, face flat down, and it didn't work. That's a key thing. I would also add at the end of this is that there are branches of NGOs, particularly international NGOs, from my experience, and they compete with each other. We're a better branch than your branch. It's often done on a regional basis. International NGOs, they'll congregate in being Latin America or West Africa or Eastern Southern Africa, or they can a particular region, but they compete with each other. The directors of those organizations want to feel, we've had the best, we've had the gold stars, we've got the gold medals, we've got something that you can learn from us and take forward. One point that in my career, that just a very small bit, and it relates to Nigeria. Plan was working across West Africa, but it wasn't in the country with more children than the rest of West Africa put together. It wasn't in Nigeria. It was a bizarre situation. In Senegal, in Niger, in Togo, in Ghana, everywhere else, but not Nigeria. And the chief executive came to me and said, which country should we go into? And immediately, you can imagine which country I'm putting number one. And we did the research. What's the justification to go into a country? That's why there is a Plan Nigeria. I think it's been now almost 10 years. And I'm very happy that Plan Nigeria will be competing with Plan Togo to have the best interventions on these things. My research said they should go into North Korea. North Korea will not happen for a little while longer, but at some point Plan will go in North Korea when things go belly up and we can get in there. But my main point is that the competition for staff is something you don't realize when you are a candidate. People will be, and you may not think it, people will be looking at you. What's the difference? What's the experience? What's a little bit of volunteering that you've done to show that you can handle the work and the strain that you might, because you might be in some very difficult situations. I think Pan Nigeria is largely in the north. You've got lots of humanitarian issues. From my own experience with HIV and AIDS, terrible situations of water and nobody having any sanitation at all, completely unhygienic, insanitary conditions. How do you turn that around? So my main point is that the market for PhDs who can do research, can do monitoring, can do evaluation, can write reports, can present this in different forums is really crucial. And that's the way I would go. That soft, indirect way of volunteering and interns, but the more direct way of applications. Don't do scattergun. Think about the sectors, or the part of the NGO world that you really have an interest in, because this is going to be a career. This is not just for a year or so. This is going to be a career. Just like being an academic, it's going to be a career. And you have to think of logic, what you're going to do in a year's time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. Are you going to climb the tree of NGOs? Or so have a think about that as well. Those kind of ways of entering with your fresh certificate into working. That's the key. That's my contribution to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. You actually segued into a very interesting related area that's increasingly being peopled by people with PhD. You call it the M&E ecosystem. I would like to call it the MERL ecosystem: monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. And it's an emerging ecosystem that is growing tremendously on the continent. There's African Evaluation Association. There's AGDIN, African Gender and Development Evaluation Network. There's SAMIA, South African Monetary and Evaluation Association. They've made it very clear that evaluation is not research, because they are two different questions. But you need research skills for evaluation, for monitoring, and of course, you move further into research and learning. In our institution, we actually frame all of this around what we call impact. And we look at the whole element of transformation and tracking impact and systemic change within the context of the work that is being done. And many bilaterals, many development organizations are emphasizing impact. And the question is, how do you measure impact? How do you tell the stories of impact? How do you recognize impact when you see it? How do you develop a framework for impact? So there's a whole world of that. But I want to also raise an interesting question, because you posed it, Simon, that area is also beginning to professionalize. So you have masters in evaluation, monitoring and evaluation. You have PhDs, you have certificates in monitoring and evaluation. But the interesting thing is that you do not necessarily need to have been trained, because it's actually tremendously, it's an interesting area. It has a combination of process and values that are slightly different from the research. Occasionally, you talk about the objectivity of research, and you talk about research questions not being predetermined. In evaluation, although you are open, occasionally you are tracking from a particular, it's not necessarily unilinear, but you are actually asking specific questions related to project implementation, program implementation. And of course, areas of research that actually follow that include action research, include all the various tools that we use in harvesting knowledge and information. So that's a very interesting area. But 3/4 of the time, they are using the skills that we get from the doctoral programs, the skills of rigor, of logic, of critical systems thinking, of ecosystems analysis. So this is but you cannot just be doing your PhD in linguistics and you say you want to go into M&E. And I'm using linguistics not because I know there's actually the logics of linguistics are tremendous. It's a very logical disciplinary area. You cannot be doing your PhD there and not pay attention to what is happening in M&E, not pay attention to that ecosystem. And actually, there's been tremendous, as a result of the nature of the development world, And as a result of the evolution of the development world and the need for accountability in the development world, evaluation has grown as a professional field over the past 2-3 decades. At University of Witwatersrand, I think you have CLARE that is located there, funded by the World Bank and co. I think you also have that in University Sheikh Anta Diop. I think some of the universities are also, I think Nairobi and co. And evaluation is increasingly being tied to some of the more interesting areas of work in humanitarian work, in peace building and all. So that's something else. But the whole point that our panelists are saying, there are two elements here. They're talking about intentionality. You must make up your mind, and you can hedge your bet. Okay, I'm going to look for a 10-year position, but also I want to do something, but you are not going to be doing what is called the blunderbuss. You're just going to be scattershooting. You say, okay, I want to join a bilateral organization that works with children, or works on gender, or works on peace building. And then the second bit, in a world like today, we're Googling. All you need to do is do a Google search at the beginning. In a world like today, you can find a lot of things online. So you have intentionality, and then you have the action. You cannot dream of working in a bilateral, or working in ECA, or working anywhere without really, the regional economic commissions, the peace building institutions, the philanthropies. And within Nigeria, thank you, Simon, for telling Plan to come to Nigeria. And I know that the last head of Plan in Nigeria had a PhD. My good friend, whom I'm sure knows very well, is, I think, transited to something else now. The interesting thing about all of these sectors is that you must begin to find them. So I'll say to our doctoral colleagues, our fresh docs, our postdocs, our graduate students, one intentionality: to go Google. Google jobs in peace building. Google jobs in libraries, international. Good job. All of these DVEX, there are lots of resources out there. So this is very important. And you and they call on the comment, you said evaluation isn't research. One needs the research skill. That's true. Evaluation needs research skills, but because of the way it asks questions, it's not research. So now let me come back to our colleague who raised the question. Has he taken his flight? He's gone.
Yeah, he has gone. I think we can, if you don't mind, I think we can start taking questions from the audience, and then so that they can also be involved and also share their experience. We don't know if we have colleagues who also work in development and another related fields, and if they would also like to share their views. So one way is, if you want to talk, if you raise your hand, I will just allow you to talk. Then you talk, and then you can ask questions to all the panelists, or specifically, or share yours. But please be brief because of time, please. So I think the first, I would like Aminu. Please be brief and don't spend too much. Don't spend. Just be brief, please. I will promote you then. So you should be able to talk. So go ahead. Go ahead and make your contribution. Go ahead, please, Aminu.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you once again for those wonderful insights. I just want to go straight to ask that sometimes from my observation, there's a little bit of difficulty, especially by scholars in Nigeria here, to situate themselves within the community of scholarship, either locally or internationally, or within both. So I think it will be, appreciated if some highlights will be given on some of the brief processes as a starting point, and then through, so that people can understand, because sometimes the connections are not just readily available. Maybe there may be some tricks around that. So that's just my question. I think that can be elaborated.
Does any of our colleagues come in, or should I jump in?
Well, I'm not sure if I.
Go on, please. Yeah. Amina, please go on. Yes, you're right on the ground.
Yes, thank you. I think if I understood Aminu correctly, he was talking about the fact that some of our colleagues situated between the local and international academic community, and sometimes they can't find the entry point in terms of how they might collaborate. I hope I understood what Aminu was speaking to. And I wanted to give an example of myself, in the sense that I think the thing that I have noticed that works is that you have to begin to, be part of a community before you need to find that community. You cannot be an island unto yourself, and then all of a sudden you want to make a connection to another community. I left Ahmadu Bello University, since 2000, technically speaking, but I have never entirely left because of those connections that I have to the department, because some of my mentees are now, teachers and deans and all of that. And because the work that I do in philanthropy finds relevance by supporting the academia. So we need to see ourselves as bridges, as it were. It's not enough to stay in the academia and think, well, let me just do what I need to do within this space. We've got to find and keep those communities. I think it was Dr. Hip that talked about the need to volunteer. It's so important sometimes to write articles. For example, the universities and the media and labor movement have always had a very organic relationship. And it's important to keep that relationship because we need each other. We need the intellectual input. We also need the organizational ability of labor to be able to push back at the state, especially in instances where, for example, as we've had for the past 6 or so months, there's been the impasse between the federal government of Nigeria and academic staff union of universities. So those kind of relationships matter. And I think for those of us in the academia, it's important to also encourage our students, even ever before they get to the point of being PhD students, to pay attention to the nature of the state and society, and to encourage them to, have webinars or seminars or just analytical working papers in terms of what are some of those new learnings in the ecosystem that the academia needs to begin to be thinking about. Sometimes there's a lot of worry about the fact that the rigor of research in some of our public institutions is not really what it used to be. In fact, a whole lot more research happens outside now than within the four walls of our public institutions, sadly. And it need not be the case at all, because in encouraging that connection between the ivory tower and the community around it, there's a lot of symbiotic advantages that can occur. That can be beneficial to both sides. And then it becomes very organic in terms of going in and out. What about sabbaticals? You can actually go into a non-governmental organization to do a sabbatical. For example, you might not get paid much. Most times it won't be about the money, but it will be about the learning and the community that you engender, because sometime, we're going to need each other.
Okay, should I let another person talk so that we can have, okay, go ahead. Busayo, go ahead. Unmute yourself. Go ahead. Okay, if you're not there, let's pick someone else because we're out of time. So we just have to be quick before our panelists have to go somewhere. Then Balogun, please go ahead. Balogun, are you there?
Hello,
Okay.
can you get?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Okay, having listened to everything that has been said, given the peculiarities of things in Nigeria. The whole essence of getting a PhD is geared towards, fulfilling one's academic ambition by becoming the lecturer. I'm just getting information that there's life beyond just the academia. But how does one now get information concerning how to diversify away from the academia? That's my question.
I actually, thank you. I wanted to talk about some networks that exist on the in Nigeria and on the continent. And I think Amina has mentioned some of those. I think you, like everybody said, you cannot sit isolated in an island. I think this is one example of what the LSA is doing. And then the IFE Institute for Advanced Studies has also had sessions like this around social sciences and the humanities. These are institutions that really cater for the social science and the humanities graduate students about life beyond or outside of the academia, or just bridging and moving in between. So I think the first element is intentionality. Within Nigeria, Nigeria is actually a very fascinating space, although we do have a large population, and therefore that makes competition very, very difficult all through. The density of networks and the professional groups exist. You just have to make sure you plug yourself into it and search. I think the digital space is a very important place to keep searching, to keep registering, to be parts of things. I know, for instance, a training that is coming up from the WITS Business School on doctoral writing. And I was told by the people who are planning it that there's actually an oversubscription from Nigeria. Every time there's something, I think it's just the competition in terms of the population density. But it's the first thing is intentionality. The second thing is what all the panelists have talked about: volunteer, engage, throw your name out there. There's also another network, the Social Science Research Council, Next Generation Scholars Program, the Social Science Research Council Peace Building Network, led by Cyril Obi and co. There are various networks that are paying attention to the doctoral groups. So you really do need to look out for them. And then the second one that I found out, Prof, you will give me a chance to say this, and this is very important. The belief at home is that if you do not know somebody, you cannot make it. I have been involved in the International Fellowships Program of the Ford Foundation. I've been involved in fellowships program from PASGA. I've been involved in fellowships program from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Each time we come home, I'm sure from the LSA too, you will notice that you do not know. You need to know somebody in some of these spaces. It is the quality of your concept paper, the quality of your proposal. So do not believe, oh, I need to know somebody to be able to get shortlisted for something in what LSA is doing. Professor Saheed Aderito does not need to know you. It's the same thing with the IFE Advanced Institute. It's the same thing for the SSRC. A lot of these academic programs and knowledge ecosystems programs, you don't need to know anybody. Don't be deterred. Put in your stuff, and if you fail, write to say, why didn't you shortlist me? What was the problem? I want to know where I went wrong, and raise the questions. Simon, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add about Nigeria is a very large country, but it's also chopped itself up into political zones, and NGOs, international NGOs, also split this country, our country, up into areas that they're particularly focused in. And they sometimes they have to pick a northern state, they have to pick a southern state, they have to pick a western state or an eastern state. They chop Nigeria into smaller parts for comparative reasons. And you need to know, if you're South-South, what's going on at Unical, what's going on at Uni-Euro. You will need to know what's going on at Uniport. And the best way is with your supervisor, with your academics. They are academics with one hat on. On the other hand, they are consultants. They love consultancy. It gets them dollars, it gets them pounds, it gets them some travel and some shopping, let's be honest, but it also finds ways that they sometimes don't want to actually do the research that their consultancy gains. They want other people to do the field research. And I have found on several occasions that a professor has got a consultancy from a foreign body and has immediately farmed it out to their doctoral students or to their postgrads who have finished and have got a good relations. It builds a network that they can do that consultancy. The consultancy gets done, their name is on the report, but other people get paid and get into their foot through the door, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that's another key way. You really need to think about how connected your academics are. Maybe they're not, and maybe you will show the way, but there are ways that academics, as in the UK and the US, they're looking for consultancies. If you go to any British academics page, they will list you how many consultancies they've done. Their universities need those academics to do consultancies, and those academics need to do consultancies to keep their ideas fresh and their networks connected. And that's the way you can connect in as well. You've got to be a bit pushy, but there are ways that you can find out through your supervisor, through your academics, through your department, what are they going for? Maybe they're going for as a collective to do some work on gender in Calabar. They need more researchers. So that's another way I would go for, with that. In terms of networks, our good chairman has listed you many things. I would absolutely recommend the DevX, and I would just keep in looking for, and there are big lists. There are big lists of these jobs, but being a bit more selective. Be selective in what you go for, because you can spread yourself too thin, and you're just scattergun. To use the phrase, you're just scattergunning, and there are many applicants. It's a big country with many applicants, and you have to be quite specific and quite focused on the things that you really, really want. Thank you.
Oh, okay, I think we don't have any hands up. Do you mind, can we just call it a day and call on Stephanie Efevutu to give a vote of thanks? Stephanie, are you there? Let me see. Let me see. Stephanie, are you there?
If I may, Chair, while we're looking for my sister Stephanie, I'm sure Professor Saheed is trying to get Stephanie in because I'd insisted that I must hear another female voice apart from mine. I almost didn't join this panel because I have a principle. I would not be the only female on the panel. And that's another thing you have to have if you're going to move into this space. You've got to have your own principles, you've got to have your values, and you've got to keep to them. And another thing is a local language. You have to understand and speak the local language, at least one local language of that area where you think you want to work. It's a stellar resource to have in your kitty. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to add these few words.
Okay, thank you so Dr. Salu, thank you so much for that comment. And I tried honestly with the email. I know you emailed me about this, and I replied by telling you the amount of effort I put into bringing another female colleague who unfortunately could not attend because of schedule conflict. But in the LSA, we try as much as possible to make sure that all perspectives are heard, and we do this all the time. Thanks so much for bringing that up again. So, Stephanie, can you go ahead and give the vote of thanks?
Okay, thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. It's my privilege to be asked to give today's vote of thanks. On behalf of all the attendees present, I would like to express our deep sense of appreciation to the speakers for the wonderful insight they shared today on how we as graduate students can begin to envision ways to expand our career prospects beyond the four walls of the classroom. Let me start by thanking Dr. Tade Aina for sharing to this occasion. Sir, the point you raised about the PhD being the beginning of learning and how we need to be able to combine multiple portfolios is really, really very appreciated. Then I also like to express our gratitude to the discussants, Dr. Mark, Dr. Simon, Dr. Dipo, and Dr. Amina. We are all inspired by the great works you've been doing and for your contributions made today. Something that stands out for me especially is for us to be open to learning new skills beyond what is being taught in the classroom and even what is being needed in our own discipline, and how we can begin to look into volunteering and engaging more within our communities. Then thank you to Professor Said and the Lagos Studies Association for this platform they usually provide for us to get insights from scholars and from practitioners on the ground on how we can begin to think of ways to advance professionally. So thank you very much, and I really, really appreciate. Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma. To have the lovely day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
And
you.
I will once we download the videos, I will share the link for everyone to have access to the video. I really appreciate your time for allowing us to learn from your experience, and it's been a brilliant experience just listening to you and all the things you've been working. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay.